The blizzard that swept across the Montana territories in '88 didn't just bring snow. For Josephine Finch, a widow living in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, it brought the devil to her door. Not with horns and a pitchfork, but with a bullet in his side, and a face etched with the kind of pain that freezes a soul harder than any winter wind. He was a ghost collapsing against her door, a spectre of the violent world she'd worked so hard to escape. The choice she made that night, between the deafening safety of her solitude and the desperate plea in a stranger's eyes, would be the kindling for a fire that could either warm her lonely cabin or burn it all to the ground. The wind was a living thing. It clawed at the log cabin's chinking, shrieked through the eaves, and hurled fists of snow against the single glass-paned window Josephine Finch had so painstakingly installed herself. For 2 days the world beyond her small clearing had been erased, swallowed by a churning, infinite white. It was a loneliness she was accustomed to, a stark silence, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the rhythmic thump of her axe splitting kindling. Her late husband Thomas had taught her that. "The land gives Josie," he'd said, his voice warm as the summer sun. "But it demands respect. You listen to it, and it'll tell you what's coming." She had listened, and her stores were full, her cabin secure. She was stirring a pot of venison stew, the savory scent, a small comfort against the storm's fury, when she heard it. It wasn't the wind. It was a dull, desperate thud against the heavy oak door, then another weaker this time. Her heart hammered against her ribs. No one came this far up the trail, not even in good weather. Trappers kept to the lower valleys, and the nearest town, Redemption Creek, was a hard day's ride south. To be out in this blizzard was a death sentence. Her first instinct, the one that had kept her alive these 3 years since Thomas's passing, was to ignore it. To stoke the fire, bar the door, and let the storm claim whatever or whoever was out there. The world was full of men whose intentions were as cruel as the winter wind. But then came a low groan, a sound not of malice but of pure, unadulterated agony. It was a human sound, and it cut through her fear. Clutching the heavy iron poker from the hearth, she cracked the door open a few inches. The wind tore it from her grasp, slamming it wide. A figure more snow than man was slumped against the frame. He pitched forward, collapsing onto the rough-hewn floorboards in a heap of worn leather and frozen canvas. Josephine slammed the door shut, the bar falling into place with a heavy thud. For a moment, she just stared, her breath misting in the sudden chill. The man on her floor was big, with broad shoulders that strained the seams of his duster. His face, half hidden by a tangle of dark, wet hair and a scruffy beard, was pale as bone china. But it was the dark, ugly stain spreading across his left side that held her gaze. It melted the snow around him into a grim, pinkish slush. Blood. "Mister," she whispered, poking his shoulder with the tip of the poker. He didn't move. His breathing was a shallow, ragged rasp. She knelt her caution, warring with the healer's instinct her mother had instilled in her. Pushing aside the heavy duster, she saw the source of the bleeding. A ragged hole in his side, torn and blackened at the edges. A gunshot wound, and a nasty one at that. He was burning with fever. She could feel the heat radiating from him, even in the cold air. "Let him die," a cold, practical voice whispered in her mind. "He's trouble. Men with bullet holes are always trouble." But then she saw his hand, curled loosely on the floor. It was a strong hand, calloused and scarred, but his fingers were long, almost elegant. It was a hand that looked like it knew how to work. It reminded her just for a painful second of Thomas's. With a sigh that surrendered to fate, Josephine made her choice. She couldn't drag him, not with that wound. Grunting with effort, she managed to roll him onto the bearskin rug in front of the fire. She fetched her medical kit, a wooden box filled with herbs, clean rags, a bottle of whiskey, and a thin, sharp knife. First the gun. She couldn't tend to him while he was armed. With a grimace of distaste, she unbuckled the heavy leather gunbelt from his hips. The revolver was a Colt Peacemaker, its wooden grip worn smooth from use. The belt held a line of brass cartridges that glinted in the firelight. It felt unnaturally heavy in her hands, a solid piece of evidence of the violent life he led. She carried it to her bedroom, wrapped it in an old oilcloth, and shoved it deep under her mattress, a serpent she'd rather not see. Returning to the stranger, she took a deep breath. She cut away the blood-stiffened fabric of his shirt. The wound was worse than she'd thought. Angry, inflamed, and deep. The bullet was still in there. "All right, mister," she murmured more to herself than to the unconscious man. "You were fool enough to get shot and get lost in a blizzard. Let's see if you're lucky enough to have stumbled onto the one cabin in 50 miles with a woman who knows how to dig out lead." She poured a generous amount of whiskey onto a rag and began to clean the wound. The man flinched a deep groan, rumbling in his chest, but he didn't wake. She poured another splash between his lips, hoping some of it would go down. Then, sterilizing the tip of her knife in the fire until it glowed red, she set her jaw and went to work. The cabin, her sanctuary of solitude, was now a makeshift infirmary, its silence broken by the howl of the storm and the pained breathing of the dangerous ghost she had let in. For 3 days, the man hovered in the grey space between life and death, and Josephine became his anchor to the world. The blizzard raged outside, sealing them in a cocoon of swirling white and roaring wind. Inside, the only sounds were the crackling fire, the bubbling of broth on the hearth, and the stranger's fevered whispers. She'd managed to extract the bullet, a flattened piece of lead she'd dropped into an empty jar with a grim clink. She'd stitched the wound with a steady hand, packed it with a poultice of yarrow and plantain to stave off infection, and bound it tightly with clean linen. Now all she could do was wait and listen. In his delirium, pieces of his life broke free, disjointed and raw. He spoke of dust and silver, of a place called Sonora. He'd cry out a name, Silas, sometimes in anger, sometimes in what sounded like betrayal. He'd murmur about a hand of cards, a crooked deal, and a promise broken. It wasn't my fault. The child. I didn't know. He'd rasp his hands, clenching into fists. Josephine sponged his brow with cool water, forcing spoonfuls of broth between his cracked lips. Each whispered phrase was a piece of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Silas. A broken promise. A child. The words painted a portrait of a man tangled in something dark and violent. She found herself studying his face in the flickering firelight when he was quiet. The harsh lines of pain softened in sleep, revealing a man younger than she'd first thought, perhaps no older than 30. A long scar cut a pale line through his left eyebrow, giving him a perpetually serious look. It was a face that had seen too much, a face that belonged with the heavy Colt revolver she had hidden away. On the second night, a particularly violent fever took hold. He thrashed on the pallet, his eyes wide, and unseeing, his body slick with sweat. He grabbed her wrist, his grip surprisingly strong. "Don't let him find it." He choked out his gaze, fixed on something only he could see. The map. In the lining. "Don't let Silas." His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed into unconsciousness. Josephine gently pried her wrist free, her heart pounding. A map. She looked at his discarded duster, lying in a heap by the door. Resisting the urge was impossible. Her hands trembling slightly, she picked it up. It was heavy, made of thick, oiled canvas, and smelled of trail dust, leather, and something metallic like old blood. She ran her fingers along the inside lining. Near the hem, she felt it a stiff, square object stitched between the layers of fabric. Her fingers worked at the rough stitches with her sewing knife until she could pull it free. It wasn't paper, but a piece of soft, treated deerskin folded small. Unfolding it revealed a crude, hand-drawn map. It showed a series of canyons, a twisted rock formation that looked like a serpent's head, and an X marked beside a symbol for a mine entrance. Scrawled at the bottom were the words, Cueva del Diablo, the Devil's Share. She stared at it, the implications chilling her to the bone. This wasn't just a man running from a gunfight. This was a man running with a secret valuable enough to kill for. The name Silas echoed in her mind. This map was likely what he wanted, and what had earned this man a bullet in his side. Quickly she folded the map and tucked it into the small locked box where she kept her husband's papers and the deed to the cabin. Out of sight, but not out of mind. It felt like holding a hot coal. His trouble was no longer just the wound in his side. It was a tangible thing, a secret she now shared. On the morning of the 4th day, the blizzard broke. Sunlight sharp and brilliant streamed through the window, reflecting off a world of pristine, untouched snow. And in that clean new light, the stranger's eyes opened. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, like a winter sky after a storm. For a long moment, they were unfocused, clouded with confusion. Then they settled on her. They were wary, intelligent, and held no trace of the fever's madness. "Where?" He rasped, his voice a dry crackle. "My cabin." Josephine answered her voice even. She held a dipper of water to his lips. "You collapsed at my door 3 days ago." He drank deeply, then sagged back against the pillows she had propped behind him. His gaze swept the small cabin, taking in the stone hearth, the neatly stacked firewood, the drying herbs hanging from the rafters. His eyes lingered on the empty pegs by the door, where a man's coat and gunbelt would hang. Then they returned to her. "I owe you my thanks, Ma'am. You owe me an explanation." She countered, her tone sharper than she intended. People don't usually end up with bullet holes in them by accident, especially not in the middle of a blizzard. A guarded look shuttered his face. The brief vulnerability was gone, replaced by the caution of a hunted animal. "Trouble found me, that's all. It seems to have followed you right to my door," she said, refusing to back down. "I've got a right to know what kind of trouble I'm keeping." He stared at her for a long moment, his blue eyes assessing her, weighing her. She met his gaze without flinching, her own resolve, as solid as the mountains outside. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. "The name's Caleb Rourke," he said. "But folks call me Cal." It was a start. But Josephine knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that the name was just the first layer of a story that was far from over. And she was already in deeper than she'd ever meant to be. The days that followed were a quiet, careful dance. Cal, as he called himself, was a man of few words, and Josephine was a woman who had learned to appreciate silence. Yet the small cabin seemed to shrink with his presence, the air thick with unspoken questions. As his strength returned, a routine formed. Josephine would tend to his wound each morning, changing the dressing with a professional detachment she didn't quite feel. His skin was warm beneath her fingers, the muscles of his back and shoulders coiled with a wiry strength. He never complained, merely watching her with those unnervingly direct blue eyes. He insisted on helping. At first it was small things. He'd sit by the fire and mend one of her worn blankets with the clumsy focus of a man unaccustomed to a needle and thread. Then he was carving new handles for her tools, his hands once limp with fever, now steady and skilled. He moved with a quiet economy, a man who wasted no energy. Their conversations were like building a fire with damp wood, slow to catch, requiring patience. They spoke of practical things, the depth of the snow, the best wood for burning the signs of a coming thaw. He never spoke of his past, and she never asked about the map or the name Silas. It was a locked door between them, and she was content for now to leave it closed. She learned about him in pieces. She saw the way his eyes tracked the deer that ventured into the clearing, not with a hunter's gaze, but with a quiet appreciation. She noticed he couldn't sleep through the night, often sitting up to stare into the dying embers of the fire, his face a mask of troubled thoughts. One afternoon, he found Thomas's old whittling knives. He picked up a block of pine, and over the next few days carved a breathtakingly detailed hawk, its wings poised for flight. He had an artist's hands, a jarring contrast to the smooth, worn grip of the revolver she had hidden. "You've got a skill for that," she said, running a finger over the smooth wood. He shrugged his eyes on the fire. "Something to pass the time. My father taught me. Said a man who can't make something with his hands ain't much of a man." It was the first he'd spoken of family, a flicker of the man he might have been before trouble found him. A week after the blizzard, a new sound broke the mountain silence, the jingle of a harness and the creak of wagon wheels. Josephine's heart leapt into her throat. It was Jedediah Miller, the owner of the Redemption Creek General Store. He made a run up to the outlying homesteads once a month, when the weather allowed a welcome sight that was now a source of pure dread. "Get in the cellar," she hissed at Cal, her eyes wide with panic. Cal didn't question it. He moved with a speed that belied his recent injury, grabbing the hawk carving and disappearing through the trap door in the floor, just as a hearty knock sounded at the door. Josephine smoothed her apron, took a deep breath, and opened it to Jedediah's round, cheerful face. "Mornin', Josie," he boomed, his breath pluming in the cold air. "Figured you'd be about ready for some coffee beans and news, Lord, that was some storm. Had us worried. I managed fine, Jedediah," she said, forcing a calm smile. "Good to see a friendly face. Come in, warm yourself." As Jedediah unloaded her supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and a bolt of calico, she hadn't ordered, but he'd brought anyway, because it matched her eyes. He filled the cabin with the town's chatter. He spoke of births and deaths, of a squabble over water rights, and then his voice lowered of something else. "Sheriff's been on edge," he said, leaning over the counter he'd set up on her table. "Got a wire from the U.S. Marshals. They're hunting the rest of the Blackstone gang. Vicious lot. Heard they hit a silver transport down near the Arizona border a month back. Left 3 guards dead. Word is their leader, a real devil named Silas Kane, came through this territory." Josephine felt the blood drain from her face. Silas Kane, the name from Cal's fevered whispers. The Blackstone gang. "They think he's up here?" she asked, her voice tight. "Looking for him and a man who double-crossed him. One of his own, apparently. Ran off with something Kane wants back, real bad. There's a $1,000 bounty on Kane, 500 on his deserter." Jedediah squinted at her. "You're looking a bit pale, Josie. This solitude getting to you?" "Just a chill," she lied, forcing a laugh. "The cabin gets drafty." After Jedediah left, the cabin felt unnervingly quiet again. Josephine stood by the window, watching his wagon disappear down the trail until it was just a speck, a $1,000 bounty, a vicious gang, and the man who had double-crossed them was sitting in her cellar. She lifted the trap door. Cal was sitting on the dirt steps, the wooden hawk held loosely in his hands. He looked up at her, and she knew from the grim set of his jaw that he had heard every word. The careful dance was over. The silence between them was no longer one of peace, but of a terrible shared knowledge. "The Blackstone gang," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "That's your trouble, isn't it, Cal? You rode with them." He didn't deny it. He just met her gaze, his blue eyes full of a storm that made the blizzard seem like a summer shower. "It is," he said, his voice flat and heavy. "And now I reckon it's yours too." The thaw came in earnest a few days later, turning the pristine snow to a landscape of muddy rivulets and sodden earth. The trail to Redemption Creek was passable if treacherous. Their supplies were dwindling, particularly the salt for preserving meat, and more urgently, the laudanum and clean bandages for Cal's wound. The infection, though beaten back, was a constant threat. A trip to town was unavoidable. The decision hung between them, a silent, weighty thing. For her to go was a risk. For him to go was impossible. "I'll be fine," Cal said, his voice rough. He was sitting at the table, his movements still stiff. "The wound is mending." "It's weeping again," Josephine stated flatly, refusing to soften the truth. "And we're out of coffee. I'm not facing another week without coffee." "I'm going." The journey to Redemption Creek felt different this time. The familiar path, usually a comfort, now seemed fraught with unseen eyes. Every rustle in the pines, every shadow stretching across the trail, made her hand twitch toward the small pistol Thomas had taught her to use, now tucked in her saddlebag. The name Silas Kane was a brand on her thoughts. Redemption Creek was a typical frontier town, a single dusty street flanked by wooden buildings, a constant hum of activity from the saloon, the blacksmith, and the general store. But today, it felt sinister. She saw faces she didn't recognize, hard-faced men with watchful eyes, loitering outside the saloon. They didn't look like prospectors or ranchers. They looked like wolves. She tied her horse, Buck, in front of Miller's general store, trying to appear as calm and unassuming as always. Inside, the familiar smell of cinnamon leather and smoked bacon did little to soothe her nerves. "Josie, good to see you again so soon." Jedediah Miller greeted her warmly. "Forget something. Running low on a few things," she said, handing him her list. As he bustled about, gathering her items, her eyes strayed to the sheriff's office across the street. A new notice was tacked to the board outside. Her blood ran cold. She made her excuses to Jedediah and crossed the muddy street, her boots sinking into the mire. There, nailed to the rough plank wall, were 2 wanted posters. The first was a crude but menacing sketch of a man with cold eyes and a cruel twist to his lips. Silas Kane, wanted for robbery and murder, $1,000 reward. The second poster was for an unnamed man, John Doe, wanted for questioning, accomplice to the Blackstone gang. Information leading to his capture, $500 reward. The sketch was vague, a generic face that could have been anyone, but the description below made her stomach clench. Approx, 30 years of age, 6 feet tall, dark hair, blue eyes, scar through left eyebrow. It was him. It was Cal. She felt dizzy, a roaring in her ears. $500. It was a fortune. Enough for a person to start a new life, to buy a real ranch, to leave the harshness of the mountains behind forever. It was a tempting sum for anyone in a town where fortunes were scarce. "Find something interesting, Mrs. Finch." She jumped, spinning around to face Sheriff Brody. He was a tall, lean man with a drooping grey mustache and eyes that had seen too much to be surprised by anything. "Sheriff," she stammered, trying to regain her composure. "Just curious. It's frightening to think such men are in the area." "It is?" Brody agreed, his gaze sharp and assessing. He looked from the poster back to her. "Haven't seen any strangers up your way, have you? You're pretty isolated up there. A good place for a man to lay low." The question was casual, but the weight behind it was immense. This was her chance. She could tell him everything. Tell him about the man in her cabin, the wound, the delirious whispers. She could claim the $500 and wash her hands of Caleb Rourke and his dark, dangerous world. It would be the safe thing to do, the sensible thing. But then she thought of the hawk carving, of the quiet way he watched the sunset, of the raw pain in his voice when he'd mumbled about a child. She thought of the trust, fragile as it was, that had begun to grow between them in the silent cabin. To betray that felt like a different kind of death. "No sheriff," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "The only stranger I've seen is the snow. It's been quiet." Sheriff Brody held her gaze for a beat longer, his expression unreadable. "Well, you keep your eyes open. These aren't men to be trifled with, Kane especially. He's more snake than man. If you see anything, you fire 2 shots, wait a minute, then fire 1 more. I'll come riding. I'll remember that. Thank you, Sheriff." She walked back to the store, on trembling legs, collected her supplies, and loaded them onto Buck. As she rode out of town, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The hard-faced men outside the saloon were still there, and their eyes followed her until she was out of sight. They weren't lawmen. They were waiting. They were hunting. The ride home was a blur of fear and resolve. She had lied to the law. She had chosen a side. She was no longer just a woman sheltering a wounded stranger. She was an accomplice. The shadow of Redemption Creek, with its bounties and its hunters, now stretched all the way to her isolated cabin in the mountains. And she knew with a terrifying certainty that the real storm was yet to come. Josephine arrived back at the cabin as twilight bled purple and orange across the snow-capped peaks. The air was cold and still, but inside her, a storm of anxiety raged. She unsaddled Buck, her movements quick and jerky, before storming into the cabin and slamming the door behind her. Cal was on his feet, standing by the hearth, a rifle, Thomas's old Winchester, held loosely in his hands. He'd been watching for her. He took one look at her pale, set face, and knew. "You saw it," he said. It wasn't a question. A wanted poster, she confirmed, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. She threw her saddlebags onto the table, the tins and packages rattling. $500 for a man with blue eyes and a scar through his eyebrow, and $1,000 for your friend, Silas Kane. She rounded on him, her control finally snapping. "You didn't just ride with them, did you?" Jedediah said. "A man double-crossed Kane. That he ran off with something. That was you. This isn't just about you leaving a gang, is it? You stole from them." Cal flinched as if she'd struck him. He carefully leaned the rifle against the mantelpiece and turned to face her fully. The firelight cast deep shadows on his face, making the scar over his eye seem like a fresh wound. "Sit down, Josephine," he said, his voice low and heavy, with a weariness that went bone deep. "You've earned the whole truth." She hesitated, then sank onto a stool, wrapping her arms around herself. He remained standing, a defendant, before his judge. "I was with them for nearly 2 years. He began, his gaze fixed on a point in the fire, seeing a past she could only imagine. "I fell in with them after I had nothing left. Kane has a way about him. Makes you feel like you're part of something, a king in the making. At first, it was just stagecoaches' payrolls, men with guns guarding money. It felt not right, but not pure evil either." He paused, swallowing hard. "But Kane changed. Or maybe he was always that way, and I just didn't want to see it. The jobs got uglier. He started enjoying the fear. The last one. That was the end for me. It was supposed to be a silver transport from a mine in the Chiricahuas. Simple job, he said. But the information was bad. It wasn't a transport wagon. It was the mine owner's private coach. He was taking his family east. Cal's voice dropped to a pained whisper. Cain didn't care. He stopped the coach. The owner, a man named Abernathy, stood his ground. He had a little girl with him, no older than 8. She was holding a little porcelain doll. He trailed off, his jaw working. Cain told him to throw down the lockbox. Abernathy did. It wasn't enough for Silas. He wanted to make an example. He wanted their fear. He raised his pistol. Josephine held her breath. I yelled. Cal said, his voice raw. I distracted him. Abernathy went for his own gun. One of Cain's men shot him. In the chaos, I grabbed the lockbox and fired a shot near Cain's head to make him duck. I just wanted them to get away. The coachman whipped the horses, and the coach bolted. I saw the little girl's face in the window, her eyes wide. She didn't even cry. She was just staring. I ran. But Cain's men were on me. They shot my horse out from under me. I took a bullet in the side, but I kept going on foot into the mountains. I thought I'd lost them. He looked at her, his eyes full of self-loathing. The lockbox didn't have silver in it. It had mining deeds and a map to Cain's private hoard, the silver he's been skimming for years and hiding away. He must have forced Abernathy to draw it for him. That's what he wants back. Not just the map, but his pride. He can't let someone walk away from him, especially not after making him look like a fool. He finally sank onto the stool opposite her, burying his face in his hands. The confession ripped from him, left a gaping silence in the room. All the pieces clicked into place, the delirious whispers, the map she had hidden, the haunted look in his eyes. Josephine looked at the man before her, no longer a simple drifter or a common outlaw. He was a man who had drawn a line in the sand, a man who had traded his life for the sake of a child he didn't know. His past was dark, yes, but in that one moment, he had chosen the light, and he had been paying for it ever since. Her anger evaporated, replaced by a wave of something far more complicated and dangerous empathy. She understood now. The men in town weren't just bounty hunters looking for a payday. They were Cain's men, scouring the territory, waiting for him to break cover. And Sheriff Brody's warning wasn't just friendly advice. It was a premonition. She got up, walked to the hearth and picked up the small wooden hawk Cal had carved. She turned it over and over in her hands. It was a beautiful wild thing forever poised on the edge of freedom. "Where is the map, Cal?" she asked softly. He looked up, surprised by the gentleness in her voice. I stitched it into the lining of my duster. I have it," she said, meeting his gaze. "I found it when you were in your fever. It's safe." A look of profound relief washed over his face, followed quickly by a dawning horror. "Josephine, you have to give me up. Take the map to the sheriff. Tell him everything. You can still get out of this clean. And what about you? Cain will find me eventually. This is my fight. You brought this fight to my door. Caleb Rourke," she said, her voice quiet but firm as the mountain stone. "When I dragged you inside, it became my fight too. Lying to Sheriff Brody made it my fight. Hiding that map made it my fight." She walked over to the small locked box, retrieved the deerskin map, and brought it to the table, laying it flat between them. The crude drawing of the Cueva del Diablo seemed to glow in the lamplight. So she said, looking not at the map, but at him. "You're going to tell me everything you know about Silas Cain, his habits, his men, how he thinks, because he is coming for this map. And when he does, this cabin will be ready for him." In that moment, the trust between them was no longer fragile. It was forged in the weight of his confession and the steel of her decision. They were no longer a lonely widow and a wounded drifter. They were allies bound by a dangerous secret, waiting for a devil to come calling. 3 days passed in a tense, purposeful quiet. The cabin was transformed from a home into a fortress. Under Cal's direction, Josephine reinforced the door with an iron bar from the forge and boarded up half the window, leaving only a narrow slit for viewing and shooting. They stacked firewood against the inner walls to absorb stray bullets. Cal, though still favoring his side, moved with a grim determination, checking sight lines, planning fields of fire. He showed Josephine how to reload Thomas's Winchester, swiftly, how to lead a moving target, his hands briefly covering hers, a spark of warmth in the cold reality of their task. The waiting was the worst part. Every snap of a twig, every cry of a hawk sent a jolt of adrenaline through them. They spoke in low tones, their shared purpose, creating an intimacy deeper than words. She learned he was from a small farm in Ohio, that he'd headed west searching for something he could never quite name. He learned about Thomas, about her love for the unforgiving beauty of the mountains, about the stubborn independence that was both her shield and her prison. The devil arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the subtle crunch of hooves on melting snow. It was late afternoon. Josephine was at the window slit when she saw them 5 riders emerging from the tree line, moving with the unhurried confidence of predators who knew their prey was cornered. At their head was a man on a big black stallion. Even from a distance, he radiated a palpable menace. He was dressed in a fine black coat, a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. Silas Kane. "They're here," she said, her voice a dead calm. Cal was beside her in an instant, his face grim. 5 of them. More than I thought he'd bring. He checked the Colt at his hip, his own gunbelt, which Josephine had returned to him the day before. It looked natural on him again, a part of him he could no longer deny. Stay away from the door, The riders stopped 100 yards out, fanning into a semicircle. Kane dismounted his movements, fluid and arrogant. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply stood there, his hands on his hips, studying the cabin, as if it were a piece of property he was considering buying. Caleb Kane's voice boomed, carrying easily in the still mountain air. It was a rich, charismatic voice, the kind that could sway a jury or lull a victim. "I know you're in there, my boy, and I know you're not alone. I had my men follow the good woman from town. A bit careless of you letting her play errand girl." Josephine's blood ran cold. They had been watching her all along. "I'm not a patient man," Caleb Kane continued, taking a slow step forward. "But I am a reasonable one. Send out the map and I'll let you and the lady live. I'll even give you a horse, a clean break. You have my word." Cal let out a short, harsh laugh. "His word is worth less than the dirt on his boots," he muttered to Josephine. Then he shouted back, his voice ringing with defiance. "Your word is what got a bullet in my back." Silas, ride on before you get another. Kane's charming demeanor vanished. His face hardened into a vicious mask. Wrong answer. He turned to his men. "Burn them out." One of the riders dismounted, unstrapping a torch and an oil flask. He began walking toward the cabin, a smirk on his face. The one on the left, Cal said calmly to Josephine, who had the Winchester pressed to her shoulder, its stock cool against her cheek. "Aim for the chest. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull." Her heart hammered. She had shot deer and rabbits, but never a man. She centered the rifle sight on the man's torso. He was getting closer. The torch now lit its flame, a hungry orange tongue. She took a breath, let it out, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, its report echoing through the valley. The man with the torch stopped, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He dropped the torch and crumpled to the ground. All hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted from the tree line. Bullets thudded into the log walls, splintering wood, one whining through the window slit to bury itself in the far wall. Josephine and Cal dropped to the floor, crawling to their positions. Cal took the main window, while Josephine covered a small peephole they had drilled in the back wall. The siege was a nightmare of noise, smoke, and terror. Hours blurred together. The sun began to set, painting the sky in bloody hues. Kane's men were smart. They didn't charge blindly. They used the trees and rocks for cover, laying down, suppressing fire, trying to draw them out. One of the men tried to circle around to the back. Josephine saw him darting between the pines. Her hands were shaking, but Cal's instruction was a calm anchor in her mind. "Squeeze, don't pull." She fired. A cry of pain told her she'd hit him, though she couldn't tell how badly. Suddenly a new sound cut through the gunfire, the frantic ringing of the heavy cast-iron bell Josephine kept outside to scare off bears. "What in God's name?" Cal breathed. They risked a glance. One of Kane's men had made a mad dash for the cabin, under covering fire, and was now pressed against the wall, right below the window, where they couldn't get a clear shot. He was trying to smash the window frame with the butt of his rifle. Before Cal could react, Josephine moved. She grabbed the heavy iron kettle of boiling water from the hearth, a desperate, wild idea sparking in her mind. Scurrying to the window, she ignored Cal's shout of warning, stood up, and dumped the entire contents of the kettle straight down. A horrific, inhuman scream tore through the air, followed by a string of curses. The man staggered back into the open, his face and chest scalded, clawing at his clothes. Cal's colt barked once, and the man fell silent. There were only two left now, Kane and one other. A tense silence fell. "You've got grit, woman," Kane's voice called out, laced with a newfound chilling respect. "A shame to waste it on a traitor. This is your last chance." "Come out now, it's almost dark," Cal whispered to her, his face streaked with sweat and grime. "That's our best chance. They'll either rush us at dusk or try to wait us out." But they didn't have to wait. From down the trail a new sound emerged, a single clear gunshot, followed by a 1-minute pause. Then a second shot. Sheriff Brody. No, it was 3 shots for help. This was different. Kane and his remaining man heard it too. They exchanged panicked glances. They had lingered too long. A posse was coming. "This ain't over," Caleb Kane roared. He fired a last defiant volley at the cabin. Then he and his man scrambled for their horses and disappeared into the darkening woods, leaving their dead behind. Silence descended, absolute and profound. The cabin was a wreck, splintered and smoky, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. Josephine slid down the wall, the heavy Winchester slipping from her numb fingers. She was shaking uncontrollably, the aftermath of the battle flooding her system. Cal knelt beside her. He didn't say anything. He just took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. His touch was solid, real. They had survived. They had faced the devil at their door and sent him running. In the ruins of her quiet life, surrounded by the evidence of terrible violence, they weren't a widow and a drifter anymore. They were 2 survivors watching the last light fade from a world they had fought side by side to keep. Dawn broke over a scene of quiet devastation. The bodies of the 3 outlaws lay in the clearing, like discarded dolls, a grim testament to the battle. The cabin bore its scars, proudly pockmarked with bullet holes and splintered wood. A short while later, Sheriff Brody and a posse of 3 deputies arrived at their horses, steaming in the crisp morning air. Brody took in the scene with his practiced, weary eyes, the dead men, the fortified cabin, the determined look on Josephine's face, and the man with the scar standing beside her, a Colt strapped to his hip. The story came out pieced together between Cal and Josephine. They told him everything, the blizzard, the wound, the Blackstone gang, the map and the siege. Cal laid the deerskin map on the table for the sheriff to see. Brody listened without interruption, his gaze moving between them. When they were finished, he picked up the map. This Cueva del Diablo, it's what brought Cain here. It's what got these men killed. He looked at Cal. The bounty on you is for questioning. After what you and Mrs. Finch have told me, and seeing this, I'd say you've been thoroughly questioned. He turned to his deputies. Finn, you and the boys get these bodies loaded up. We'll bury them in an unmarked plot outside of town. They've earned nothing more. As the deputies went about their grim work, Brody folded the map and tucked it into his coat pocket. As far as I'm concerned, he said, looking pointedly at Cal, the man named on that poster was never found. He likely died of his wounds somewhere up in these mountains. The map to Cain's silver was recovered after a tip-off led us to this skirmish. The U.S. Marshals will be happy to have it. Silas Cain is my problem now, and I will hunt him to the ends of the earth. It was a gift, a clean slate. Brody was intentionally burying Cal's past, right here in the blood-soaked soil of Josephine's clearing. I'm in your debt, Sheriff, Cal said, his voice thick with emotion. No, Brody said, his eyes shifting to Josephine. You're in hers. See you don't make her regret it. He tipped his hat. Ma'am. And with that, he and his posse rode away, leaving a profound silence in their wake. The finality of it all settled over the cabin. The immediate danger was gone, but the future was a vast, unwritten page. Cal walked to the center of the room, the floorboards creaking under his weight. His gaze swept over the destruction, the splintered table, the bullet-scarred walls, the shattered window. This was his world, the world of violence and death, and it had smashed its way into her sanctuary. Slowly his hands went to his waist. He unbuckled the heavy gun belt. The leather creaked in protest. He held it for a moment, the weight of it a familiar burden. It was the symbol of his past, of the man he had been forced to become. With a quiet reverence, he coiled it and laid it on the mantelpiece beneath the wooden hawk he had carved. The Colt peacemaker lay there, finally at peace. He turned to Josephine, his face a canvas of regret and gratitude. I can't thank you for what you've done, Josephine. There aren't words for it. But I can't stay. I've brought nothing but trouble to your door. I'll fix what I can, and then I'll be gone. You deserve your peace back. He was going to walk away, to leave her in the quiet life he had so thoroughly shattered. He thought it was the honorable thing to do to protect her from any future trouble that might follow him. But Josephine had faced down Silas Cain's men. She had lied to the law and dumped boiling water on a killer. The timid, cautious part of her had been burned away in the fire of the siege. She knew what she wanted, and it was no longer a life of safe, lonely silence. She crossed the room and stood before him. She looked at the mantelpiece, where the gun belt lay like a sleeping snake. Then she looked at his empty hands, hands that could carve a hawk or expertly handle a gun, hands that had held hers in the terrifying aftermath of the battle. She reached out and took one of those hands in hers. Her touch was firm, unwavering. Cal looked down at their joined hands, a flicker of disbelief and hope in his blue eyes. My peace was just a different kind of quiet, Cal. She said, her voice clear and strong. I'm tired of being quiet. This cabin, it's just wood and stone. It's not a life. She squeezed his hand. So you can fix the walls, and then you can take me with you. We can find a new place. A place where the only thing that follows us is the sunrise. A slow smile spread across Caleb Rourke's face, erasing the last of the shadows. He looked from her determined eyes to the gun belt on the mantel, a life left behind. Then he looked back at her, his rescuer, his ally, his future. He didn't need words. He simply tightened his grip on her hand, a silent promise to never let go. Together they walked out the door, leaving the scarred cabin and the ghosts of the past behind them. They stepped into the bright, clean light of a new day, their path uncertain, but their hands and their hearts firmly locked together. And so the story of Josephine Finch and Caleb Rourke isn't just a tale of survival in the Old West. It's a story about the choices that define us. The choice to open a door to a stranger, the choice to trust when every instinct screams otherwise, and the profound choice to leave behind the life you knew for the promise of a hand to hold in the unknown. It's a testament to the fact that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't silver buried in the hills, but the quiet courage found in the human heart. They walked away not from something, but toward everything, proving that a home isn't always a place, but a person. If their journey into the sunset moved, you please give this video a like, share it with someone who loves a true Western tale, and subscribe for more stories from the untamed frontier. Your support helps us keep these legends alive. Let us know in the comments what part of their story resonated with you the most. Thank you for listening.